Why did God command the absolute erasure of one specific bloodline from history? Not just a defeat, but a total annihilation of their memory. They were the Amalekites, the only people against whom the Creator swore an eternal war. We are taught that they vanished into the dust of antiquity thousands of years ago, but that is a lie. And here is the most astonishing part. They didn't disappear, they evolved. What if the Bible's ultimate enemy is still operating in our world today, hidden in plain sight? To understand a hatred that transcends time, we must descend into the genesis of a blood feud so ancient it predates the existence of the nation of Israel itself. This war did not begin on a battlefield. It began in the intimate betrayal of a family. Imagine the sheer weight of a destiny stolen, a cosmic inheritance ripped away in a moment of hunger and deception. It begins with two brothers, twins, wrestling in the womb, destined to become two nations. Jacob and Esau. We know the story well. Jacob the heel catcher takes the birthright. He seizes the blessing intended for the firstborn, but history is often written by the victors. To understand Amalek, we must look into the eyes of the vanquished. What happens to the rage of a man who believes God himself has turned against him? Esau's bitter cry when he discovered he had been supplanted did not vanish into the ether. It festered. It became a legacy, a psychological inheritance passed down to his son Eliphaz. But the true catalyst, the spark that ignited this primordial grudge into an eternal flame, was a woman named Timna. The ancient texts reveal that Timna was a princess of the Horites, royalty in her own right. Yet, drawn by the spiritual magnitude of the patriarchs, she sought to join the house of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She came not as a conqueror, but as a seeker, willing to humble herself, but the doors were bolted shut. The patriarchs, seeing something unstable in her essence, rejected her. Cast aside and humiliated, she made a choice that would haunt the world forever. She declared that it was better to be a servant in the house of Esau than a mistress in the house of kings. She became the concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son. From this union of a bitter grandfather's stolen glory and a spurned mother's vengeance, Amalek was born. Amalek was not merely a child. He was the personification of rejection. He grew up on the knees of Esau, listening to the stories of the stolen blessing, fed on the milk of his mother's humiliation. He was raised to believe that the descendants of Jacob the Israelites were the usurpers of his rightful place in the cosmos. The hatred was his birthright. It was the only thing he truly owned. As the family expanded, they transformed. They moved away from the fertile lands and plunged into the abyss of the wilderness. They claimed the Negev, a land of scorching heat, jagged rock, and unforgiving scarcity. The geography forged their soul. In the Negev, there is no mercy. Weakness is a death sentence. To survive in such a furnace, the descendants of Amalek ceased to be a mere family and became a nomadic warrior culture. They became the wolves of the desert, while other nations settled, built cities, and planted crops. The Amalekites honed the art of the raid. They became masters of irregular warfare, striking from the shimmering heat haze and vanishing before a defense could be mounted. But what truly set them apart was not their tactics, but their spirit. In the ancient world, even among pagans, there existed a concept known as the fear of God, a universal understanding of moral boundaries and divine retribution. Travelers, the weak and the weary, were generally afforded a baseline of protection under the eyes of the gods. But the Amalekites possessed no such fear. They had severed their connection to the moral fabric of the universe. They did not view the vulnerable as objects of pity. They viewed them as prey. They became the antimatter to Israel's matter. Where Israel was destined to bring law and light, Amalek was the embodiment of chaos and lawlessness. They were the first nation to realize that to destroy a people, you do not need to defeat their strongest warriors. You only need to terrorize their weakest links. They waited in the shadows of history, sharpening their blades, watching the horizon for the descendants of Jacob to emerge from Egypt. And when the moment came, they would not meet them with honor, but with a cruelty that would shock the Creator himself. The waters of the Red Sea had scarcely settled over the ruins of Pharaoh's army when the silence of the Sinai was shattered. The children of Israel, a mass of millions liberated from centuries of slavery, were drifting through the wilderness of Shur and Sin. They were not yet a nation of warriors. They were a vast, undulating sea of refugees. They were exhausted, thirsty, and disorganized. A column stretching for miles under the relentless, blinding sun. At the front of this column marched the strong, the leaders, the ones carrying the Ark of the Covenant and the banner of the God who had just humiliated the greatest empire on earth. But the column had a tail. Far behind the vanguard, miles away from the protective presence of Moses, lagged the stragglers. Here walked the elderly, their skin weathered by decades of brickmaking. Here were the sick, stumbling on blistered feet. Here were the pregnant women and the heavy laden, dragging the meager possessions of a life built in bondage. They were the most vulnerable souls in the camp, the ones who could not keep pace with the march of destiny. Picture the scene as the sun begins to dip below the jagged horizon, casting long, distorting shadows across the valley of Rephidim. The air grows cold. The dust settles. The vulnerable assume they are safe, protected by the sheer magnitude of their numbers and the reputation of their God. But they were being watched from the cliffs and the crevices of the red rocks. Eyes devoid of mercy were tracking their every limp and stumble. The Amalekites had arrived. They did not sound a trumpet. They did not send an emissary to declare war. They did not seek a contest of strength against the vanguard of Joshua. That would have been the way of honorable men. Instead, they waited until the strong were out of sight, and then they descended like a plague of locusts upon the weak. The scriptures in Deuteronomy describe this act with a chilling specificity. They cut off the tail. It was a massacre of the helpless. The Amalekites fell upon the rear of the column with a savagery that defied the conventions of the ancient world. They slaughtered the grandfathers and the grandmothers. They put the sword to the infirm. They butchered children who had just tasted their first breath of freedom in the ancient Near East. There existed an unwritten law of the desert, a code of hospitality and warfare, even amidst blood feuds. One did not target the weary and the thirsty without cause. To strike a traveler who was faint from the journey was considered an abomination, a direct insult to the divine order. But Amalek had no fear of God. They looked upon the feebleness of the slaves, not with compassion, but with opportunistic malice. They saw the vulnerability of the Israelites as an invitation to violate the sanctity of life itself. The psychological impact of this strike was devastating. The Israelites had just witnessed the supernatural power of Yahweh. They believed themselves untouchable. Suddenly, they were reminded of their mortality in the most brutal fashion possible. Panic rippled from the rear forward. The joy of liberation was instantly replaced by the terror of the hunt. This was the Amalekite strategy, to inject fear into the bloodstream of the newborn nation, to prove that their God could not protect the weak, to break their spirit before a true battle could even be fought. When the news reached Moses at the front of the line, the realization must have been more terrifying than the sight of Pharaoh's chariots. This was not a dispute over water rights. This was not a clash over territory. Moses understood that he was facing an enemy that operated outside the boundaries of human morality. This was a hatred that sought total extinction. The Amalekites were not fighting to live. They were fighting to ensure Israel died. Why is this specific battle remembered as the ultimate act of cowardice in the Torah? Because it was a strike against the very throne of God. By targeting the tail of the camp, Amalek attacked the part of the body that represents the weary and the downtrodden, the very people God claims as his special protectees. It was an act of supreme spiritual arrogance. They declared that the laws of heaven did not apply in their desert. This was the sin at Rephidim. It was here, amidst the cries of the dying elderly and the blood-soaked sand, that the nature of the enemy was fully revealed. They were not merely a rival tribe. They were the antithesis of the covenant. They had touched the apple of God's eye, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. For as the sun rose the next morning, Moses would not just call for a defense. He would climb the hill to initiate a war that would last until the end of time. The dust of the desert floor had barely settled from the initial slaughter. When the realization dawned, this would not be a mere skirmish. It was a war for existence. For the first time, the liberated slaves of Egypt were forced to become soldiers. They possessed no iron chariots, no drilled phalanxes, only the desperation of the hunted and the raw memory of the lash. Into this breach stepped a young warrior, unproven but destined for greatness. Joshua. This is the first time the name Joshua appears in the biblical narrative. He was tasked with the impossible to rally a terrified mob against the wolves of the desert, the apex predators of the Negev. But the true battle was not destined to be decided by the sharpness of Joshua's blade or the strength of his arm. It would be decided on the peaks above, in a realm where the physical and the spiritual collide. While the metal clashed in the valley, a different kind of warfare commenced on the hilltop. Moses, the old prophet, ascended the heights. In his grip was not a spear, but the staff of God. The same dry wood that had turned the Nile to blood summoned the locusts and split the Red Sea. This was the conductor's baton for the symphony of destruction about to unfold. He stood, silhouetted against the blinding Sinai sun, accompanied by his brother Aaron and the nobleman Hur, and then he lifted his arms. Picture the scene, a solitary figure reaching toward the heavens, holding the wooden rod horizontal to the sky, a living bridge between the divine decree and the dust of the earth. Immediately, the chaotic melee below shifted. As long as Moses held the staff aloft, the untrained Israelites fought with the fury of lions. They pushed the Amalekites back. The supernatural power flowed through the prophet, down the mountain, and into the arms of Joshua's men. It was a visual manifestation of a spiritual truth. Victory over Amalek was not earned by human strength, but received through connection with the divine. It was a display of cosmic authority. But Moses was mortal. He was 80 years old. The human body is not built to hold a posture of surrender and authority forever. Gravity, the oldest law of the earth, began to drag at his limbs. The blood drained from his fingers. The muscles in his shoulders began to scream in agony. The weight of the staff became the weight of the entire nation. And as his hands trembled and fell, the tide of war instantly turned. In the valley, the Amalekites surged forward. Their primal savagery overwhelmed the Hebrew line. The link was broken. Can you feel the terror of that moment? The realization that the survival of an entire people hinged on the failing deltoids of one old man. It was a terrifying, vivid display of the frailty of flesh. As the prophet's arms sagged, the protective covering over Israel evaporated. The Amalekites, sensing weakness, tore into the ranks of the former slaves. The leader was collapsing, and with him, the promise of the future. It was here, on the precipice of total defeat, that the narrative shifts from individual heroism to collective endurance. Aaron and Hur did not simply watch their leader fail. They did not try to take the staff from him, nor did they run down to the valley to fight in his stead. They understood the assignment. They found a stone, a symbol of permanence and stability, and placed it under him. Then, they took their stations. Aaron on one side, Hur on the other. They did not just offer words of encouragement. They physically bore the weight of the burden. They took the heavy, trembling hands of the prophet and propped them up. The image is iconic, burned into the collective consciousness of faith. 3 men on a hill, locked together in a sculpture of desperate intercession. It was no longer just Moses. It was a unified front. With his arms supported, the conduit reopened. The divine energy rushed back into the valley below. Joshua felt the surge. The sword grew light in his hand. The Amalekites, those masters of terror who feared no God, suddenly found themselves fighting a force they could not intimidate. They were being driven back not by superior tactics, but by the relentless, unyielding posture of the figure on the mountain. The rhythm of the battle obeyed the staff. The violence raged until the sun began to dip behind the jagged horizon. Hour after hour, Aaron and Hur held fast, their own bodies aching, becoming living pillars of stone. They ensured that the staff remained elevated until the very last ray of light faded. Joshua overwhelmed Amalek with the edge of the sword. The wolves were beaten back into the darkness, but as the dust settled and the groans of the dying echoed off the canyon walls, a chilling truth remained. This was not the end. The Amalekites were defeated, but not destroyed. The hatred had been checked, but not extinguished. God told Moses to write this event on a scroll as a memorial and to recite it in the ears of Joshua. Why? Because the war was just beginning, for the Creator was about to issue a decree that would echo through eternity, a sentence of total erasure that would eventually bring down kings and fracture the kingdom of Israel forever. When the dust settled over the valley of Rephidim and the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the Sinai, the immediate threat of the desert wolves had been repelled. But Moses, the prophet of the Most High, knew that what had transpired was not merely a skirmish over water rights or territory. It was the opening salvo of a cosmic conflict. To mark this moment, Moses did not build a fortress. He built an altar. He named it Jehovah Nissi, the Lord is my banner. In the ancient world, a banner was a rallying point, a standard raised high above the chaos of the battlefield, to show soldiers where their loyalty lay and where their commander stood. By giving God this title, Moses was declaring that the war against Amalek was not Israel's war alone. It was God's war. The scripture records a chilling justification for this altar. It states, "Because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." The Hebrew text is difficult, obscure, and terrifying. It literally implies that a hand was lifted against the throne of the Lord. While other nations fought for land, for gold, or for slaves, Amalek was the only nation perceived as lifting its hand against the very throne of God. They did not just attack a people, they attacked the covenant itself, attempting to strangle the divine plan in its infancy. This creates a theological singularity, a black hole in the moral law of the Torah. Consider the other enemies of Israel. The Egyptians threw Hebrew infants into the Nile and enslaved the people for 400 years. Yet, the divine command regarding them is surprisingly tempered. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a stranger in his land. Consider the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, the very stock from which Amalek sprang. The command is clear. You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. But for Amalek, there is no such mercy. There is no offer of peace, no possibility of redemption, and no command to love. There is only the decree of Herem, total, absolute devotion to destruction. It is because Amalek is not merely a tribe. Amalek is a principle. They represent the cold, calculating rejection of God's government. They are the first of the nations to strike, the primordial manifestation of anti-Semitism, and the embodiment of chaotic evil that seeks to undo creation. To tolerate Amalek is to tolerate a cancer in the spiritual organs of the world. This leads us to the most perplexing command in the entire Bible, a paradox that has haunted scholars for millennia. In the book of Deuteronomy, the decree is finalized. You shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And immediately following that order, God adds, you shall not forget. This is the divine riddle. If you completely forget Amalek, if you erase their name from history, you lose the vigilance required to recognize them when they return. If you forget the nature of this evil, you become susceptible to it. God is commanding a unique form of memory, memory designed for destruction. We are commanded to remember their cruelty, their cowardice, and their distinct hatred, specifically so that we can recognize the spirit of Amalek when it resurfaces in new forms, wearing new masks. In every generation, the decree transforms the Amalekites from a biological entity into a mythological force. They become the Dark Banner, the antithesis to Jehovah Nissi. As long as God sits on his throne, Amalek stands in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness, waiting for the stragglers, waiting to cut off the tail. This is why God remembers. He remembers because the existence of Amalek is an open wound in the fabric of reality. It is a personal grievance to the Almighty. The decree is not just about revenge for a desert raid. It is about the restoration of cosmic order. The war is eternal because the opposition is fundamental, and as the Israelites prepared to enter the Promised Land, they carried this heavy burden with them, the knowledge that, while other enemies might be conquered and assimilated, Amalek must be hunted until the very memory of them is severed from the earth. But history would show that fulfilling this decree was far harder than hearing it, for when the moment of truth arrived, even the greatest of Israel's kings would falter before the face of this ancient evil. Centuries dissolved into the shifting sands. The generation of the Exodus passed into memory, and the bones of Joshua were laid to rest. Israel had entered the Promised Land, but they soon discovered that possessing the land and knowing peace were two very different things. The unity of the tribes fractured. Every man did what was right in his own eyes, and the borders of the nation became porous and bleeding. It was the dark age of the judges, a time of spiritual anarchy, and in this chaos, the ancient hatred of the south saw its opportunity. The Amalekites did not disappear after their initial defeat in the wilderness. They merely waited. They evolved into the ultimate opportunistic predator, the vultures of the desert. They understood that a nation at war with itself is a carcass waiting to be stripped. In the Book of Judges, we see Amalek rising not as a conqueror seeking to occupy territory, but as a recurring scourge designed to break the will of the Hebrews. They were masters of the alliance, finding strength in numbers by joining forces with other enemies of Israel. When the Midianites, a powerful tribal confederation, rose to crush the Israelites, they did not ride alone. This was not conventional warfare. This was economic annihilation. The Amalekites had no interest in governing the farmers of Israel. They wanted to starve them. They understood the rhythm of the seasons. They watched from the dune lines, patient as death itself, waiting for the Israelites to plow the earth and sow the seed. They waited for the rains to fall and the grain to ripen, and just as the harvest was ready, just as the promise of survival was within reach, the hammer fell. They swept in from the wilderness, their camels covering the valley floors. They destroyed the increase of the earth. They left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep nor ox nor donkey. It was a strategy of total suffocation. The Israelites were forced to hide in mountain clefts and caves, reduced to hunted animals in their own land. But why did the heavens allow this? The narrative of the Judges reveals a disturbing pattern. Amalek was not merely acting out of bloodlust. They had become a tool of divine discipline. Whenever Israel forgot their Creator and turned to the idols of Canaan, the protective hedge was removed, and the Amalekites were the rod used to strike them. They were the physical manifestation of Israel's spiritual decay. Yet, the cycle would not last forever. From the threshing floors of fear rose a man named Gideon. He was an unlikely hero, hiding in a winepress to save wheat from the raiders. But through him, the myth of Amalekite invincibility would be shattered. The coalition of Midian and Amalek lay camped in the valley of Jezreel, a massive host, confident in their overwhelming numbers. But Gideon, commanded by God, stripped his army down to a mere 300 men. It was a suicide mission by any human metric. But under the cover of darkness, they surrounded the camp. They did not attack with swords first. They attacked with sound and light. The breaking of 300 clay pitchers and the blast of 300 trumpets shattered the silence of the night. The sudden chaos terrified the nomadic horde. In the confusion, the alliance collapsed. The Amalekites, who thrived on inflicting terror, were suddenly consumed by it. They turned their swords against one another in the dark. The hunters became the prey, fleeing back into the shadows from which they came. Gideon's victory was absolute, but it was not final. The Amalekites were driven back, but they were not extinguished. They retreated to the deep desert, licking their wounds, nursing that primordial grudge. They learned from their defeat. They realized that to destroy this people, they could not merely be raiders. They had to survive until the next opportunity. The era of the judges began to close, and the cry for a king rose up from the tribes of Israel. They wanted a monarch to fight their battles, and in the jagged rocks of the Negev, the Amalekites were waiting for him. The stage was being set for the ultimate confrontation. The skirmishes were over. The final test of obedience was approaching, and Amalek would be the exam that would cost a king his crown. Centuries dissolved into the sands, and the feud simmered like magma beneath the crust of history. The wilderness wolves, the Amalekites, had continued to bleed the edges of Israel, a constant reminder of the unfinished war. But now, the era of judges had passed. Israel had crowned a king. Saul, the son of Kish, stood a head taller than any other man, a warrior monarch, chosen to break the yoke of the surrounding nations. But the throne of Israel was not merely a seat of political power. It was an altar of absolute obedience. And the test of that obedience would come in the form of an ancient, terrifying memory. The prophet Samuel came to Saul with a message that chilled the blood. It was not a call for a skirmish or a territorial dispute. It was a divine execution order. The time of patience was over. The God of hosts had remembered what Amalek did to Israel on the way up from Egypt, how they had ambushed the faint and the weary. The scales of justice, suspended for hundreds of years, were about to crash down. The command was absolute. Go and strike Amalek, and devote to destruction all that they have. There was to be no plunder, no slaves, no mercy. Man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey, all were to be erased. It was a decree of total obliteration, a surgery to cut out a malignant cancer from the human story. Before it could metastasize further, Saul gathered an army that shook the earth's 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. They descended upon the city of Amalek. The strategy was set in the valley, a trap springing shut on the desert raiders, from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. The sword of Saul devoured the enemy. The might of the Amalekite host was shattered. Their warriors fell, their strongholds crumbled, and the desert drank their blood. It was a total military victory. But in the flush of triumph, amidst the smoke and the adrenaline, Saul made a fatal calculation. He looked upon the destruction and felt the intoxicating rush of power. He saw Agag, the king of the Amalekites, not as a monster to be destroyed, but as a trophy to be paraded. To kill a king is a duty. To capture a king is a glory. And then, he looked at the livestock, the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fattened calves, and the lambs. They were too good to waste. Why destroy wealth when it could be possessed? Why pour blood into the sand when it could be offered on an altar? In that moment, Saul decided he could negotiate with the divine command. He chose the path of pragmatism over the path of purity. He spared Agag, and he spared the best of the plunder, destroying only that which was despised and worthless. He believed he could sanctify his disobedience by calling it a sacrifice. The scene shifts to Gilead. Saul stands by his monument, flushed with pride, believing he has secured his legacy. When Samuel approaches, the king greets him with a blessing, declaring, "I have performed the commandment of the Lord." But the air was filled with a sound that betrayed him. Samuel's reply is one of the most haunting lines in Scripture. He does not ask about the battle. He does not ask about the territory. He simply listens. What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? Imagine the silence that followed, broken only by the innocent, damning cries of the animals Saul had saved. Those sounds were the evidence of his compromised heart. Saul scrambled for excuses. He blamed the people. He claimed the animals were saved to sacrifice to Samuel's God, distancing himself from the deity he had just disobeyed. But the prophet cut him down with a revelation that stands as the bedrock of spiritual law. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. Because Saul had rejected the word of the Lord rejected him from being king. The dynasty was torn away in that instant, just as Samuel's robe tore in Saul's desperate grasp. The tragedy was not just the loss of a crown, but the survival of a seed. By sparing Agag, even for a few hours, Saul displayed a weakness that would echo through the ages, though Samuel would take the sword and finish the deed, hewing Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. The spiritual damage was done. The contagion of Amalek had not been fully purged. The king of Israel had hesitated, and in that hesitation, the shadow of the enemy found a way to slip through the fingers of judgment, waiting to re-emerge in a Persian palace centuries later. The dust of Gilgal settled, but the air remained heavy with the stench of disobedience. King Saul, the first monarch of Israel, stood amidst the bleating of captured sheep and the lowing of oxen, spoils of war he was commanded to destroy, yet had foolishly spared. He had won the battle, but in the eyes of the cosmos, he had lost the war. He had treated the command of total erasure as a suggestion, a political negotiation. But the God of Israel does not negotiate with Amalek. Enter Samuel, the old prophet, weather-beaten and trembling, not with age, but with a divine fury that terrified even the king. He had come to finish what the monarchy was too weak to complete. Picture the scene as the captive king Agag is brought forward. The leader of the Amalekites does not come dragging his feet in chains. The scriptures say he came to Samuel delicately. There is a terrifying arrogance in his stride, an aristocratic smoothness. Agag looked at the spared cattle, the hesitant King Saul, and the pause in the slaughter, and he calculated his odds. He believed the storm had passed. He believed that civilization had asserted itself over the primal decree of God. Agag spoke, perhaps with a smile touching his lips, uttering words that echo through the corridors of irony. Surely the bitterness of death is past. He thought he was dealing with men. He thought he was a prisoner of war, entitled to the courtesies of royalty. But he was not standing before a politician. He was standing before the vessel of the wrath of God. Samuel looked upon the face of the man whose people had preyed upon the weak, the stragglers, the weary, and the pregnant women of Israel for centuries. Samuel did not see a king. He saw a contagion. The prophet's voice rose, cracking with the weight of judgment. He did not appeal to a court of law. He appealed to the law of equivalent exchange. As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. This was not a sentence of execution. It was a sentence of completion. The text tells us that Samuel hewed Agag in pieces before the Lord. The Hebrew terminology here suggests something far more visceral than a simple beheading. It implies a dismantling, a violent separation of limb from limb. Imagine the shock of the onlookers. This was not a soldier doing the killing. This was the elderly priest, the intercessor, raising the blade and bringing it down with a strength that belied his years. It was a ritualistic purging in the ancient Hebrew worldview. This was the Herem, the ban. To place something under the ban meant it was devoted entirely to God, usually through total destruction. It was not merely killing an enemy. It was a sacrificial act of returning a corrupted thing to the void. Saul had tried to keep the best of Amalek for himself. Samuel was correcting the cosmic ledger. The blood of Agag soaking into the sands of Gilgal was the final seal on the commandments Saul had broken. But was it truly the end? Did the blade of the prophet fall quickly enough? There are whispers in the ancient commentaries, legends that haunt the margins of the text. They speak of a delay, a singular night between Agag's capture and his execution. Tradition holds that while Saul hesitated and Samuel traveled to Gilgal, the Amalekite king was not idle. In that final night of reprieve, it is said that Agag conceived a child, a seed planted in the shadow of the gallows, while Samuel washed the blood of the king from his hands. Believing the work finished, the bloodline may have already escaped. The physical body of Agag was destroyed, hewn into pieces and scattered, but the spirit of Amalek, that primordial hatred, had found a new vessel. The prophet walked away from Gilgal, severing his ties with Saul forever. He believed the chapter was closed, but history is long, and the memory of hatred is longer. The Amalekites were broken as a nation, their cities burned, their king butchered, but the escape had occurred. The timeline had split. Hundreds of years later, in a royal court far from the deserts of the Negev, a man would rise to power wearing the signet ring of the Persian Empire, man who traced his lineage directly back to the very King Samuel hacked to pieces on that bloody afternoon. The torch of destiny had passed from the faltering hand of Saul to a fugitive shepherd named David, but the ancient shadow that haunted the throne of Israel was not finished. It had smelled blood in the water, while Saul had spared the Amalekite king, losing his kingdom in the process. David would be forced to confront the same demon in the wilderness, but under far more harrowing terms. This was not a formal battle line drawn by kings. This was a personal violation that struck at the very heart of the future messianic dynasty. It happened at Ziklag. David and his band of outcasts, the mighty men who would become the foundation of Jerusalem, glory, had marched away to war, leaving their fortress unguarded. It was the moment the wolves had been waiting for. The Amalekites, masters of the opportunistic strike, swept up from the desert floor like a sudden sandstorm. Picture the devastation of the return. 3 days later, David and his warriors crested the final ridge, expecting the welcome of wives and the laughter of children. Instead, they were met with the silence of the grave and the acrid stench of ash. Ziklag was not merely burning, it had been hollowed out. The Amalekites had not just looted the city, they had abducted the future. Every woman, every son, every daughter, taken. The text tells us that these battle-hardened men, who had faced giants and armies, lifted their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. But grief quickly curdled into a murderous rage. What happens when the protectors fail those they love? The chaos that Amalek sows took root. The very men who had sworn loyalty to David picked up stones, their eyes wild with grief, threatening to execute God's anointed right there in the smoking ruins. This is the Amalekite effect, to drive God's people into such despair that they turn upon themselves. But where Saul had crumbled, David stood, in the midst of the mutiny, amidst the smoke and the screams for his blood. David strengthened himself in his God. He called for the ephod. He did not consult his generals. He consulted the sovereign. Shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? The divine answer was absolute. Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail, recover all. The chase began a desperate sprint through the trackless waste. But the wilderness is vast, and the Amalekites were ghosts. How do you find a phantom in the desert? The answer lay in the cruelty of the enemy itself. David's men stumbled upon a figure collapsing in the field, an Egyptian slave, half dead from sickness and starvation. He had been abandoned by his Amalekite master because he fell ill 3 days prior. To the Amalekite, a sick servant was dead weight, baggage to be discarded to speed up the retreat. But to David, this discarded life was the key to victory. This act of callousness became Amalek's undoing, revived with water and figs. The slave led the avengers straight to the enemy's throat. They found the raiders spread out across the landscape, celebrating their triumph. They were eating, drinking, and dancing, reveling in the spoils of Judah. They believed the God of Israel was blind, or perhaps dead. Then, the hammer fell. David launched his attack at twilight, the time of shadows. The battle was not a skirmish, it was a cataclysm. It raged from the evening gloom through the entire night and into the next day's sunset. The shepherd became the butcher. The sword of David tore through the revelry, turning their feast into a funeral. The victory was total. The scriptures record a phrase that rings with mythological power. David recovered all. Not a single child was missing. Not a piece of livestock was lost. The plunder intended to enrich the Amalekites became the spoil of the future king. However, the war did not end there. In the chaos of the slaughter, a dark remnant broke loose. 400 young men, warriors of the next generation, mounted camels and fled into the deep desert. They vanished beyond the horizon, carrying the seeds of their hatred with them, ensuring that even though David had won the day, the spirit of Amalek would survive to haunt his descendants again. For nearly half a millennium, the desert fell silent. The name of Amalek, once a terror that haunted the nightmares of the Exodus generation, vanished from the lips of prophets and kings. The bloody wars of the judges had faded into legend. The glorious kingdom of David had risen to its zenith and collapsed into ash. The Temple of Solomon lay in ruins, and the people of Israel were scattered like chaff into the winds of the Babylonian exile. To the casual observer, the ancient commandment to blot out the memory of Amalek seemed like an archaic relic, a war completed and forgotten by time. But evil does not die simply because we stop speaking its name. It waits, it hibernates, in the dark fissures of history, changing its face, learning new languages, and donning new robes, while the Jews wept by the rivers of Babylon. The seed of their destruction was quietly taking root in the gilded palaces of Persia. We are transported now to the citadel of Susa, the glittering heart of the Persian Empire. Here, amidst the hanging gardens, the pillars of marble, and the drinking vessels of gold, rises a man of immense and terrifying power. Haman. He is not a Bedouin raider, brandishing a rusted sword in the Negev dust. He is a sophisticated vizier, draped in purple silk, wielding the signet ring of the king himself. He commands the respect of nations. But look closer at his title. The ancient text introduces him with a designation that sends a shiver through the spine of anyone who knows the history of God's wars. He is called Haman, the Agagite. This is not a casual surname. This is a patronymic of blood and fire. It links him directly to Agag, the Amalekite king whom Saul spared in a moment of weakness, and whom the prophet Samuel hewed to pieces in Gibeon. The ghost of Agag had returned. The child that escaped, or the line that survived in the shadows, had clawed its way back from the brink of extinction to stand at the right hand of the world's most powerful emperor. The conflict begins at the king's gate. Haman demands worship, but one man, a Jewish exile named Mordecai, refuses to bow. This is not merely an act of religious piety. It is the recognition of a primordial enemy. Mordecai sees past the courtly finery and the political titles. He smells the ancient dust of the wilderness. He sees the shadow of Amalek and Haman. When he realizes Mordecai's heritage, his rage transcends the personal. He does not simply want to execute a defiant subordinate. That would be too small for an Amalekite. He seeks the final solution. He convinces the king to sign a decree for the total annihilation of every Jewish man, woman, and child in the 127 provinces of Persia. Because this was never about a bow. It was the ancient grudge of Esau, finally possessing the power to reclaim the stolen birthright through global bloodshed. Couriers were dispatched to the four corners of the known world, carrying the death warrant of a nation. But history has a poetic symmetry that is nothing short of divine. Who is Mordecai? The text identifies him as a Benjamite, a descendant of Kish. Do you remember who else was a Benjamite, a son of Kish? King Saul, the man who failed to destroy Agag. It is as if God arranged a cosmic rematch across the centuries. Where the first Benjamite failed to finish the job due to pride and fear, the second Benjamite was raised up to stand firm. Saul lost his crown because he spared an Amalekite. Mordecai would risk his life to destroy one. The failure of the ancestor had to be rectified by the faithfulness of the descendant. We know the end of the story, but we often miss the profound irony. Haman constructs a gallows 50 cubits high, a monument to his own ego intended for Mordecai. He casts lots to determine the day of genocide. He believes he is the master of fate, but the God of Israel, who operates in the shadows of this story without ever being named, turns the universe upside down. The predator becomes the prey. In a sudden violent reversal, Haman is stripped of his glory and hung upon the very timber he prepared for his enemy. The Agagite line was finally cut off, not on a battlefield, but in a court of law. This victory is immortalized in the festival of Purim. It is the only holiday where boisterous noise is a requirement. When the scroll is read and Haman's name is spoken, the congregation erupts with graggers and shouting, drowning out the sound of his name. It is a ritual enactment of the ancient command to blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven, leaving nothing but the silence of a memory erased. We arrive now at the darkest and most difficult precipice of the biblical narrative. To understand the war against Amalek, we must confront a Hebrew concept that makes the modern mind recoil in horror. The word is Herem. It is often translated as the ban or devoted to destruction. But these words are too sterile to capture the cataclysmic weight of the original Hebrew. Herem implies a total removal from the realm of the living and a complete surrender to the realm of the divine. It is the theology of obliteration to the modern ear. This sounds indistinguishable from genocide, yet in the brutal cadence of the ancient Near East, this was a recognized, albeit terrifying, form of total devotion. Israel was not alone in this practice. The Moabite stone, an ancient stele carved by King Mesha, boasts of slaughtering the inhabitants of Israelite cities as a form of harem to his god Chemo. In the ancient mindset, total war was a ritual. However, the biblical command regarding Amalek possessed a distinct, chilling frequency. It was not driven by the caprice of a bloodthirsty idol, but framed as a necessary cosmic surgery. We must wrestle with the text as it stands. The command was absolute. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. How does a God described as slow to anger and abounding in mercy command the sword against the innocent, against the nursing child? This is the great stumbling block of the narrative. But to grasp the theology of Herem, we must suspend our secular judgment and step into the mythological landscape of the ancients. In this worldview, Amalek was not merely a rival nation occupying a piece of land. They were diagnosed as a spiritual malignancy. The Bible presents the Amalekite spirit as a contagious, metaphysical cancer. If a surgeon finds a tumor, he does not negotiate with it. He does not spare a small portion of the cancer because it looks young or innocent. To leave even a single cell of the malignancy is to condemn the patient to death. In this scriptural metaphor, the patient is the moral destiny of the world, and Amalek is the infection that threatens to rot it from the inside out. The destruction of the Amalekites was framed not as a war of conquest, but as a desperate measure to preserve the possibility of holiness in a fallen world. This leads us to the sanctity of the ban. Imagine conquering a city filled with gold, livestock, and treasure, and being forbidden to touch a single coin. This was the supreme test of Herem. In a standard ancient war, the motivation was plunder. Soldiers fought to grow rich, to take slaves, and to expand their herds. But God removed the economic incentive entirely. The spoils of Amalek were considered Holy meaning they belonged exclusively to God. For a soldier to take a sheep or a gold ring was to steal directly from the Creator. This transformed the act of war from a raid for profit into a sterile, priestly act of judgment. The Israelites were to be the executioners, not the beneficiaries. They were to be the sword of God, cold and unfeeling, taking nothing for themselves. Ensuring that the violence could not be monedied, it teaches a terrifying archetypal lesson. Holiness is dangerous. It is not merely purity. It is a consuming fire that cannot coexist with corruption. The command of Herem reveals a God who is intolerably allergic to the type of predatory evil Amalek, represented evil that preys on the weak and mocks the moral. Order. The theology of Obliteration asserts that there are some things in this world that cannot be redeemed, only destroyed. You cannot domesticate a wolf that has tasted human blood. You cannot negotiate with the void. The instruction was clear, the logic was absolute, and the warning was severe. But the human heart is frail, and the allure of mercy, or perhaps the allure of greed disguised as mercy, is strong. And as King Saul would soon discover, the temptation to spare the best of the enemy is the fatal flaw that can cost a man his crown. The swords have rusted into nothingness, and the chariots have rotted beneath the sands. But the war is not over. If we limit our understanding of Amalek to a specific genetic lineage of desert raiders, we miss the terrifying depth of the divine command. For in the eyes of the ancient mystics, the physical nation was merely a shell, a vessel for a dark, primordial energy that transcends blood and bone. We now cross the threshold from history into the metaphysical, from the battlefield of the Sinai to the labyrinth of the human mind. According to the secret teachings of the Kabbalah, the true enemy was never just a man with a spear. It was, and remains, the internal adversary. Look closely at the architecture of the Hebrew language, where every letter is a number, and every word is a code, waiting to be broken. The sages uncovered a chilling symmetry in the arithmetic of the soul. The numerical value, the gematria of the Hebrew name, Amalek, is 240. This is precisely the same numerical value as the Hebrew word sifik, which means doubt. Amalek is the spiritual embodiment of doubt. But understand this is not the healthy, rational skepticism of a philosopher seeking truth. It is a weaponized, cynical doubt designed to sever the connection between the human and the divine. It is the voice that whispers in the ear of the believer at the height of their inspiration, "Is this real? Or are you just a fool?" It is the cold logic that seeks to dismantle the miraculous and reduce the universe to mere chance. When the Israelites exited Egypt, they had witnessed the impossible. They stood at the peak of spiritual perception. Then came Amalek, not just to kill their bodies, but to assassinate their certainty. The Torah describes the Amalekite attack with a peculiar phrase, "how he met you on the way." The Hebrew word used, karka, has a double meaning. It implies a chance encounter, but it is also derived from the root word for cold. The Midrash offers a visceral metaphor to explain this cooling. It describes the people of Israel after the Exodus as a boiling bath, scalding hot with the fire of divine revelation. No nation dared to touch them, for the heat of their purpose was terrifying. Then came Amalek. Like a madman, he leaped into the boiling bath. He was burned. Yes, he was destroyed in the process. But he achieved his sinister goal. He cooled the water. He shattered the aura of invincibility. He made it possible for the world to look at the miraculous and shrug. How often have you felt a moment of profound clarity, a surge of passion to change your life, only to have it immediately cooled by a sudden influx of mockery, apathy, or fear? That is the spirit of Amalek, operating in the present tense. It is the thermal death of the spirit. It is the force of entropy that seeks to freeze the passion of the heart and turn living faith into dead, mechanical ritual. This connects to the ancient prophecy of Balaam, who peered down from the cliffs and declared Amalek was the first of the nations. This was not a statement of chronology, but of hierarchy. In the anatomy of the soul, Amalek represents the head, the ego in its most arrogant, unyielding form. It is the first impulse of the self to declare independence from the Creator, while other nations might fear the gods or respect the unknown. Amalek represents the supreme arrogance that looks at the infinite and refuses to bow. It is the intellect that mocks the soul. Therefore, the commandment to blot out the remembrance of Amalek transforms from a decree of ancient warfare into a manual for spiritual survival. It is not a war fought with iron, but with fire. To defeat the inner Amalek, one must cultivate the opposite of doubt, conviction. One must fight the cooling with the heat of enthusiasm, the warmth of kindness, and the burning fire of purpose. The mystics teach us that as long as there is a cynical voice within us mocking our potential, the war is still raging. We must identify the coldness in our own hearts, the safek that paralyzes our growth, and obliterate it without mercy. The physical tribe may have vanished into the dust, but as long as doubt chills the human soul, the shadow of Amalek remains the ultimate enemy of mankind. History records the movements of armies and the rise of kings, but it is in the shadows of folklore that the true terror of a people is revealed. We have described the Amalekites as a warrior tribe forged by the heat of the Negev, but the legends surrounding them suggest they were something far more sinister than mere raiders. In the hushed whispers of ancient rabbinic tradition, the Amalekites were not just enemies of flesh and blood. They were practitioners of a dark art that warped reality itself. Strip away the veneer of the natural world, and you find the sorcerers of the sands. The ancient sages taught that the Amalekites possessed a knowledge of the occult that rivaled the magicians of Egypt. They were said to be masters of illusion, capable of bending the shimmering heat of the desert to cloak their movements. Some accounts go even further, drifting into the realm of the monstrous. Rabbinic literature contains terrifying suggestions that Amalekite warriors were shapeshifters, able to twist their physical forms to resemble the beasts of the wilderness, or even the Israelites themselves. Imagine the confusion of a battlefield where the enemy wears the face of your brother, or where the very shadows of the canyon walls detach themselves to strike. This was psychological warfare manifested through sorcery, designed to breed paranoia and terror in the hearts of God's people. They were not merely soldiers. They were warlocks of the wasteland, weaponizing the very air of the desert against their prey. But their supernatural reputation was not limited to magic. The folklore depicts them as physical anomalies, the hyenas of history, while normal men perished after days without water. The Amalekites were rumored to survive on the moisture of stones and the blood of their kills. They moved with an unnatural speed, darting across the dunes like wind-blown sand, striking with a velocity that defied the human frame. They were the apex predators of a wasteland where nothing was supposed to live, possessing a vitality that seemed to mock the laws of nature. The answer may lie in the forbidden bloodlines of the ancient world. We must consider the terrifying possibility that the Amalekites were carriers of the genetic legacy of the Nephilim. The Bible tells us that there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after. The region of the Negev and the lands surrounding Canaan were infested with the Rephidim, the remnants of a fallen cosmic order. Speculation has long persisted that the tribe of Amalek intermingled with these clans of giants. It transforms the narrative from a tribal skirmish into a clash of species. If the Amalekites carried the blood of the Rephidim, it explains their towering arrogance and their utter lack of fear for the Creator. They were not merely rejecting the God of Israel. They were acting out the vengeance of fallen angels. This connection paints them as the literal seed of the serpent, a hybrid monstrosity waging a war that began before the flood, seeking to crush the seed of the woman before it could bloom. This leads us to the darkest legend of all, the unholy covenant. It is whispered that the leadership of Amalek did not rely solely on steel and muscle. They forged pacts with the demonic principalities of the desert. In their zeal to extinguish the light of Israel, They offered themselves as vessels for the powers of darkness. They became the earthly anchor for a spiritual rebellion, ensuring that as long as they drew breath, the throne of God would not be complete. They were the antimatter to Israel's matter, spiritually engineered to negate the existence of the chosen people. And yet, if they were so powerful, where are their cities? Where are their great monuments? Walk the Negev today, and you will find the ruins of the Nabateans, the fortresses of the Romans, and the tells of the Canaanites. But of Amalek, nothing. This absence is not an accident of history. It is the curse of the wandering. Legend dictates that because they sought to erase a nation from existence, their own existence was condemned to be formless. They were cursed to leave no footprint in stone, no inscription on a wall, no foundation in the earth. Their legacy was doomed to be one of smoke and memory, a phantom presence that haunts the world without ever taking root. They built no empire of brick and mortar because they were the spirit of destruction itself, and destruction builds nothing. They are the ghosts of antiquity, the mythic shadows that slip through the fingers of archaeologists, leaving behind only the cold chill of a hatred that refuses to die. The sun eventually sets even on the longest hatreds, but the twilight of the Amalekites was not marked by a singular, cataclysmic explosion. Instead, it was a slow, suffocating extinction, a dismantling of a people by the relentless gears of prophecy. We look to the dusty annals of the Chronicles for their final gasp. Centuries after Saul spared Agag, and long after David broke their military spine, the last distinct remnants of this wolf tribe had retreated into the jagged heights of Mount Seir. They were no longer the scourge of the desert, but a fugitive remnant, hiding in the caves of their Edomite cousins. In the days of King Hezekiah, 500 men of the tribe of Simeon marched into those mountains and slaughtered the remaining Amalekites, dwelling in their place to this day. And then, silence. The historical record goes black. The nation that once made the superpowers of the Bronze Age tremble simply evaporates. This brings us to the assimilation hypothesis. Where did the survivors go? History suggests that the blood of Amalek did not vanish from the earth. It merely hid itself. They dissolved into the populations of the Edomites, the Arabs, and the Persians, like a virus retreating into the host's DNA to avoid detection. The Amalekites shed their tribal identity to preserve their existence. They ceased to be a kingdom and became a hidden current in the bloodstream of the Middle East. This creates a historical mystery that haunts archaeologists to this day. We have found the steles of the Assyrians, the tombs of the pharaohs, and the pottery of the Philistines. But of the Amalekites, nothing. To this day, not a single inscription, not one coin, not one monument has been definitively found that was written by the hand of an Amalek. They have been so thoroughly scrubbed from the physical record that, without the Bible, we would not know they ever existed. They are a ghost nation of people who live only in the text that demands their death. But herein lies the paradox of the decree. The command was to blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Yet, here we are, thousands of years later, speaking their name. Did the decree fail? No. The decree succeeded in a way that is far more profound than mere forgetfulness. We remember the name Amalek, but we remember nothing good about them. We know nothing of their art, their songs, their loves, or their grief. We remember them only as the archetype of evil. Their entire existence has been reduced to a single theological warning. They have been stripped of their humanity and frozen in time as the eternal enemy. This physical erasure forced a metamorphosis. Amalek ceased to be a biological lineage and became a spiritual condition. In modern discourse, the name Amalek has transcended the tribe to describe an existential threat, a force of irrational, chaotic hatred that rises against the light in every generation. When the sages say, "The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation," they are not speaking of a lost desert tribe. They are speaking of a recurring darkness, It suggests that Amalek is no longer a people you can fight with swords. It is an idea. It is the spirit that targets the weak, that mocks moral boundaries, and that sneers at the concept of sanctity. It is a shadowy force that can inhabit any nation, any ideology, and perhaps the darkest corners of the human heart. So, we return to where we began. The traveler in the desert, watched by unseen eyes. The enemy is no longer hiding behind the rocks of the Sinai. The bloodline has vanished, but the war has not ended. The physical nation was erased, but the spiritual entity was unleashed upon the world, unmoored from geography, free to roam the corridors of history. If the throne of God is not complete until the memory of Amalek is obliterated, then are we still fighting this war today? The ultimate victory was not in the past. It awaits a future where the darkness that Amalek represents is finally swallowed by the light. Until then, the warning stands. The enemy is ancient, the enemy is elusive, and the enemy is still here, for as long as there is a hand raised against the throne of the Almighty. Amalek lives. The echoes of this ancient feud still resonate in the shadows of our world. If you hunger to uncover the forbidden histories and spiritual wars that shape our reality, subscribe now and join the ranks of the Seekers. But one final mystery remains. Was the command for total erasure an act of divine justice or a terrifying tragedy? Declare your verdict in the comments below.